And now here at Columbia University, we're joined by Dr. Richard Betts, who teaches War and Peace Studies at the university. He's also the author of American Force, Dangers, Delusions, and Dilemmas in National Security. But Professor, before we start talking about your book, give us your background, if you would.
I grew up around Boston, got a PhD in government, taught for a year at Harvard, went to Washington, worked in the Senate's first investigation of the intelligence community, then did research at the Brookings Institution for 14 years before coming to Columbia. And I've occasionally been a consultant in the intelligence community and have basically done research on military affairs and national security.
You referred to the Senate committee. That was the Church Committee, correct?
Right.
What was that about, and when was that?
Well, that was in the mid-1970s, and it was a result of scandals about abuses in the intelligence community, and it led to major investigations in both the House and the Senate. And the Senate committee was under Senator Frank Church, and it investigated virtually all the intelligence agencies and all their activities. So it was a major undertaking, and it led to revealing more information about intelligence than had ever been available in public before.
How did that affect your worldview, learning what you did at the Church Committee?
Well, I found that a lot of what people think about intelligence is mythology. I learned an awful lot about particular activities, and it didn't really change my worldview. I've always been in favor of a strong position in national security for the United States, and I think that simply fortified my knowledge and sticking with the same beliefs.
Well, in your book, American Force, you describe yourself as a Cold War hawk and a post-Cold War dove. What does that mean?
Well, during the Cold War, I thought that there really was a threat from Marxism-Leninism for the loyalty of people around the world, a question about which form of political organization was eventually going to dominate the world, and therefore it was important for the United States to have a strong anti-Soviet, anti-communist policy. But after the Cold War, that threat didn't exist anymore. We won. And the threats to American national security after the Cold War, while they're not trivial, are just much, much less than they were then. And I think we haven't completely adjusted to that change in the level of threat.
Have you changed your view on whether or not the Soviet Union was the danger that it was?
No, I don't think so. It was never black and white, simple question of devils and angels. Of course, real life is always more complicated than our moral passions. But I think it's hard now, 20 years after the Cold War, for many people, especially young people who don't remember it very well, to take as seriously as we did then what was at stake. But I don't think that was a mistake. I think the Soviet Union eventually collapsed for a number of reasons, some of which had to do with the fairly staunch American policy for 40-odd years of the Cold War.
Dr. Betts, in your book and in life, since the turn of the century, we've been kind of in a constant state of war here in the United States. Is this dangerous for our national security?
It's unnecessary, and it's costly, and it's very ironic that in over 40 years of the Cold War, we fought two wars, regular-sized wars in Vietnam and Korea, and a number of smaller interventions in other places. But since the Cold War, since communism has gone away, we fought twice as many wars, smaller ones, granted, and we've undertaken at least as many interventions on a smaller scale. This seems to me to be out of whack. Now, some of them were appropriate and necessary, but some of them weren't. And I think it's especially questionable to be making this level of effort in cases where it often gets us into more trouble than we're willing to pay for, and especially now at a time when the trade-offs with other objectives that Americans have, domestic things like health care and balancing the budget and other very challenging problems, to be making that level of effort. Now, we could do all of this if we really wanted to, and really wanted to pay for it. But it seems to me that since the Cold War, Americans, especially American leaders, with a few exceptions, have simply wanted to do a lot without paying much for it. And that's what's inconsistent. If we really wanted to do all of these things, make the world safe for democracy in lots of nasty places, we could do it, but it would cost an awful lot more.
Our current strategy in Afghanistan, what are your concerns about it?
Well, this is one of the toughest ones because unlike the war in Iraq, which was completely unnecessary, the war in Afghanistan started as a war of self-defense after September 11th, since the attack was launched from Afghanistan. But it's hard to see a strategy that's practical at this point that has a big promise of success. The obstacles to success are tremendous, and while we might be able to bring it off, I think if we were willing to spend 20 years making a big investment in reforming Afghanistan, I think it's clear that Americans aren't going to do that. So the least bad alternative, I think, is something close to what the Obama administration is doing, and that is giving the Afghans a chance, handing over an improved security situation where we can, hopefully providing enough funding as our American forces withdraw to give them a chance to keep the Taliban suppressed. But there's no guarantee it's going to work.
What about intervention in Kosovo?
Well, that finally worked out in the sense that we more or less won, but at a much higher price than anticipated, and it was a very close-run thing. I think, too, that was a case where if that war was necessary, it's hard to see why a lot of other interventions were not necessary. What we went to war in Kosovo to suppress, atrocities and brutality by the Serbian regime, was no worse than what was going on in a number of other places. But nobody at the time was saying we should be doing the same thing for Sudan or places where the atrocities and government repression were even worse. So that was a case where while we came out on top in the end, it seems to me inconsistent and unnecessary to say that it had to be done.
In retrospect, what about the Korean conflict?
Well, that was, I think, a more necessary war. It was started by clear aggression from North Korea. The result of not having stopped the conquest of South Korea is something we can't know for sure, but probably would have been very dangerous for the containment policy. And I think President Truman's response was appropriate in that case.
Dr. Betts, the conventional wisdom about Vietnam is that after Vietnam, we stayed out of conflicts for a long time until the Gulf War, 1991. Is there going to be a lasting result from the Iraq War, in your view?
I suspect so, but probably not as strong a reaction for a number of reasons. For one thing, the Iraq War, as nasty as it turned out to be, was a smaller war and less costly than the Vietnam War. And secondly, most Americans have not had to pay anything for it. There's no draft, unlike in Vietnam, and the fact that people were being conscripted to fight the war in Vietnam was not a small part of why it became very unpopular. The war in Iraq became unpopular, but didn't generate any real anti-war movement because people weren't required to do anything for it. They didn't even have to pay taxes for the war in Iraq. Maybe the first war in American history where not only did we not have to pay war taxes, but taxes were cut.
What about Iran?
That's probably one of the principal dangers now, but the best way to deal with Iran, it seems to me, is to rely on more or less the policies that were effective in the Cold War against the Soviet Union and China. That's deterrence and containment. And to make clear to Iran that if they were ever to use a nuclear weapon, retaliation would be far out of line with anything they could gain. and to combine that with the current policy of ratcheting up sanctions to dissuade